I still remember the scorching day I first drove into Rosemore Crest, a suburban community nestled on the fringes of Glendale, Arizona. My relocation was meant to be a fresh start. I'd saved for years to purchase a home in a well-managed neighborhood, a place where I could enjoy the desert sunshine, friendly neighbors, and an overall sense of stability. At first glance, Rosemore Crest fit the bill perfectly. Each house rested on a neat parcel of land, with carefully manicured lawns, trimmed cacti, and tidy rock gardens suited to the arid climate. A gentle breeze carried the scent of mesquite trees, and the distant mountains appeared ghostly blue in the heat. Every real estate brochure and online review described Rosemore Crest as a haven of order, complete with an active homeowners association that coordinated everything from holiday festivals to bulk trash pickup. Admittedly, I'd heard a few cautionary tales about overzealous HOAs, but the neighborhood's calm aesthetic and the mostly welcoming attitude of the residents led me to brush aside any reservations. After signing a stack of documents nearly 2 inches thick, I walked away with the keys to a modest ranch-style house on Honeysuckle Lane. My first few nights were blissful. Although cardboard boxes cluttered the living room, I felt an almost childlike excitement about decorating and making the place my own. I intended to blend in with the desert palette, subdued browns and taupes, with a few vibrant potted succulents for emphasis. It didn't take long for me to notice that most of my neighbors' homes were similarly understated: sand-colored stucco, pale sage shutters, and occasional terracotta roofs glinting under the sun. Yet, from the moment I set foot in my new home, a subtle tension buzzed under the veneer of tranquility. A few neighbors hinted, always in quiet, discreet tones, that the HOA could be strict. More specifically, that a certain middle-aged woman on the board, who insisted everyone call her Karen, was the real power behind every regulation. A kindly older neighbor named Marilyn Johnson dropped by with a batch of homemade cookies on my second evening. She gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "I hope you settle in nicely. But be aware, we have someone here who loves making and enforcing rules. She can be a handful." At the time, I simply thanked Marilyn, not fully grasping what she meant. I was about to learn that the carefully maintained harmony of Rosemore Crest rested on shaky foundations, and that the so-called Karen would soon become a fixture in my daily life, as inescapable as the Arizona sun. Sure enough, just 4 days after I moved in, my doorbell rang sharply at 7 in the morning. Standing on the doorstep was a tall, slender woman with a short, elegantly styled bob and a pastel blouse perfectly pressed despite the early hour. She carried a clipboard beneath one arm and wore the confident posture of a soldier ready for inspection. "Hi, I'm Karen Delacroix," she said curtly, her eyes scanning past me into the house. "I'm with the Homeowners Association. May I come in?" Still in my pajamas, I felt a jolt of surprise. I gestured awkwardly, wanting to be polite but also uncomfortable about her abrupt manner. "Sure. Is there something urgent?" Without waiting for a full invitation, she stepped over the threshold. The air instantly felt heavier. "We have a few community guidelines I need to go over with you," Karen said, flipping open the clipboard. "I noticed your front yard has an uneven arrangement of rock mulch, and your shrubbery is somewhat sporadic. We try to maintain a consistent look in Rosemore Crest." I blinked. I've only just moved in. I haven't even finished unpacking boxes. The yard was set up by the previous owners. Karen gave a tight smile. "All the more reason to bring things into compliance now. We don't want the entire street looking disordered." Something about her tone rubbed me the wrong way. She was both condescending and strangely eager, as though she relished finding fault. Eventually, she left me with a leaflet outlining landscaping uniformity requirements and a thinly veiled warning that I might face citations if I didn't correct the yard soon. As I shut the door behind her, an uneasy feeling coiled in my stomach. The notion of a neighbor, an HOA board member, dictating how many rocks or shrubs I could have felt intrusive at best, tyrannical at worst. Little did I know, that was just the beginning. Over the next week, I discovered that everyone, from the family across the street to the elderly couple around the corner, had been on the receiving end of Karen's compliance checks. Some joked that she must keep a telescope pointed at every house. Others claimed she had a mental checklist of minor infractions like stray weeds, slightly tilted mailboxes, and even the color of porch light bulbs. A few longtime residents admitted she was a thorn in their side but felt powerless to confront her. Rumor had it that any direct challenge would result in a barrage of HOA violation letters, each demanding immediate fines. And so, in those first days of my new life at Rosemore Crest, a nagging worry replaced my initial excitement. Who exactly was Karen Delacroix, and how had she come to wield such authority over everyone else's choices? Despite my misgivings, I tried to settle into a routine. Early each morning, I watered the xeriscape plants that I'd begun adding around my front porch, aiming to conserve water while adding subtle beauty. Meanwhile, cardboard boxes gradually disappeared from my living room, and I hung a few paintings along the walls. Life might have continued peacefully, if not for Karen's next big initiative. It began innocently enough. A pink flyer arrived in each resident's mailbox announcing a community color upgrade. Karen, in her capacity as head of the Architectural Review Committee, claimed that Rosemore Crest would look fresh and modern if every house were repainted in a selection of pastel hues. She listed 6 or 7 color swatches: powder blue, baby pink, a faint lemon, pale mint, and so forth. Nothing in the flyer explicitly said it was mandatory, but the language strongly encouraged compliance, promising an official policy update at the next HOA meeting. I found this proposal odd, to say the least. The houses in Rosemore Crest already adhered to a generally neutral palette. Forcing them into a narrower range of Easter egg tones seemed bizarre. Yet, the day after the flyers went out, a neighbor named Heather whispered to me that Karen had told her in private, "I'm pushing for an HOA resolution making the pastel scheme mandatory. Anyone who resists will face significant fines." At first, I wrote it off as gossip, but my doubts vanished when I spoke to another neighbor, George, who'd lived here for almost a decade. He described how Karen had systematically taken over the Architectural Review Committee, bullied other board members into resigning, and then stacked the HOA leadership with people who rarely opposed her. "She's a control freak," he said, sighing heavily. Last year, she tried to ban clay pots from front gardens, claimed the color clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. It didn't pass, but only because the board had a few folks who stood up to her. Now, with new people in place, she's unstoppable. Word soon spread that a special HOA meeting would be held to discuss officializing the pastel mandate. I decided to attend, determined to learn more. The meeting took place in the Rosemore Crest Community Center, a small, bland-looking building near the entrance of our subdivision. About 50 people showed up, a larger turnout than usual, I was told, and we sat on folding chairs facing a long table where 5 board members, including Karen, presided. Karen wore a pastel lilac blazer that evening, as if to set an example. She also had an impressive stack of documents and a slideshow ready to go. With a pointed smile, she launched into her pitch. "Neighbors, we want to keep Rosemore Crest at the forefront of beautiful, tasteful communities. Pastel exteriors will unify our look, raise property values, and create a welcoming environment." Some in the audience exchanged skeptical glances. A few raised their hands to ask about the cost of repainting. Karen brushed them off with vague reassurances about how it's not that expensive if we all do it together, and think of the resale benefits. One elderly gentleman asked if there was any bylaw permitting such a forced color scheme. Karen insisted that the Architectural Review Committee had broad authority to enforce aesthetic guidelines and that the community brand was paramount. By the end of the meeting, though no official vote occurred, Karen implied that the board had agreed in principle and that specific instructions, along with deadlines, would follow. She waved her hand dismissively at any talk of choice. "This is for the greater good," she proclaimed, her voice echoing off the plain beige walls of the room. "We must keep Rosemore Crest pristine and cohesive." I left the meeting feeling uneasy, as did many others. A small group of us gathered in the parking lot afterward, sharing our disbelief at the proposal. A middle-aged man named Andre said he loved his deep tan stucco walls and refused to change them. Elaine, a young mother of 2, fretted about the cost. Her budget simply couldn't handle a repaint, especially in an unusual pastel shade that might require multiple coats. We considered banding together to challenge Karen, but no one was entirely sure how to proceed. The HOA's rules were notoriously dense, and Karen had proven adept at twisting them to her advantage. A few days later, an official HOA letter hit our mailboxes. It read like a decree. All homes are to be repainted in one of the approved pastel colors within 90 days. Failure to comply may result in fines up to $100 per day. The letter was signed not just by Karen, but by every other board member, though I suspected she had coerced them. A ripple of panic spread through the community. People began calling painters for quotes, fearful of incurring daily penalties. Pastel color samples started appearing on doorsteps. The transformation was underway, like an unstoppable wave. And thus, the seeds of a pastel revolution were sown. Rosemore Crest, once a tranquil if somewhat colorless suburb, now braced itself for a mandatory makeover. Karen's makeover. Little did anyone suspect that her micromanaging would soon reach ridiculous extremes, igniting an even stranger conflict involving midnight trespassing and clandestine flower planting. My immediate reaction to the pastel mandate was a mix of anger and resignation. While I hated the idea of someone dictating my home's appearance, I also dreaded the possibility of incurring crippling fines. Nevertheless, a stubborn streak in me refused to bow so easily. I pored over the HOA covenants, searching for loopholes or past amendments that could undermine Karen's edict. I found references to harmonious color schemes and board-approved paint palettes, but nothing that stated we had to choose from only a handful of pastel swatches. The original rules were broad, allowing everything from light browns to pale greens. When I brought this up to a neighbor named Chloe, she nodded grimly. "We tried to tell Karen that these rules weren't so narrow," Chloe said, "but she claims the board has reinterpreted them. She says it's within their authority to refine the guidelines as needed." Chloe was a former paralegal, but even she felt outmatched by the HOA's labyrinthine language. It'd take a solid legal effort to fight this. And who has the time or money? As the days passed, entire blocks began morphing into pastel wonderlands. Crews of painters arrived at dawn, scaling ladders to coat stucco walls in delicate pinks, yellows, and minty greens. In theory, these colors might be charming in a beach community or a storybook village, but in the harsh southwestern glare, they sometimes looked washed out or downright odd. I saw neighbors wringing their hands about the final results, worried it might reduce, not increase, curb appeal. Worse still, stories of Karen's intimidation tactics multiplied. If a homeowner hesitated or seemed reluctant, Karen would appear at their door with the dreaded clipboard, reminding them of the ticking deadline. An elderly widow on the next street, Mrs. Alvarez, confided in me that Karen had threatened to impose a lien on her property if she didn't start repainting immediately. "I live on a fixed income," Mrs. Alvarez whispered, her eyes moist with worry. "I can barely afford groceries, let alone repainting my whole house." Yet for every person who caved, a few quietly resisted. I learned of secret phone calls and text chains among the holdouts, those determined to challenge Karen's authority. We shared copies of older HOA documents, discussed potential group petitions, and considered pooling resources for a lawyer. But we also recognized the risk. Any open defiance invited Karen's wrath. She had become a de facto tyrant, selectively citing bylaws to clamp down on any sign of rebellion. Amid these tensions, rumors circulated about Karen's own house. Some claimed she had never bothered to get official approval for her elaborate garden structures or her pastel fence. An irony, given her crusade. But no one had clear proof, and confronting her based on hearsay could backfire. I found myself drawn into hushed conversations on sidewalks or at the small community playground. Parents swapped horror stories of Karen scolding their children for drawing chalk art that wasn't in keeping with community standards. A retired couple recounted how Karen demanded they remove their modest solar garden lights because they weren't specifically listed in the HOA's guidelines. Every day seemed to bring a new anecdote, fueling an undercurrent of resentment. One evening, I attended an informal gathering at Linda's house. She was the kindly retiree who'd first warned me about Karen. About a dozen neighbors showed up, each bearing snacks or drinks. Over bowls of salsa and chips, we commiserated about the pastel fiasco. Linda had a binder full of past HOA newsletters, which revealed how flexible the association had once been. "Look at this from 5 years ago," she said, tapping a page with an older color chart that allowed for numerous earthy tones. "We had variety back then. Karen's changed everything in the last year." We debated strategies for hours, writing to local officials, confronting the board at the next official meeting, or even staging a protest. However, a deep sense of discouragement permeated the group. Karen's reign felt unassailable. "She's got the backing of the new board," muttered Gerald, an accountant by trade. "Unless we can prove serious misconduct, they won't remove her." Little did we know that proof of misconduct would soon land right in our laps, delivered by none other than Karen herself, under cover of darkness. It started one Friday morning when I stepped outside to water my plants, only to discover something startling. A neat row of bright red geraniums had materialized overnight in my front yard. They were planted in a shallow trench along the pathway, clashing spectacularly with the subtle desert landscaping I'd painstakingly arranged. At first, I thought it might be a neighborly prank. But the more I examined the scene, the more suspicious I grew. Fresh potting soil, perfectly spaced flowers, footprints in the dirt. Someone had done this with deliberate care. Baffled, I wandered over to my next-door neighbor, Timothy, who shrugged and said he'd heard digging noises around midnight, but assumed it was me. Another neighbor, across the street, reported seeing a silhouette with a small shovel, but couldn't make out the person's features. Word soon spread about my mysterious new flowers, and speculation ran wild. Could it have been a misguided attempt at beautification, or was someone trying to sabotage me by violating the Pastel edict? A few nights later, Chloe texted me at nearly 1 a.m. "I think someone's messing with my yard too." Sure enough, the next morning, Chloe found a random assortment of neon pink begonias near her mailbox, planted in neat clusters. "I didn't put them there," she said, exasperated. "And it's so hypocritical. These are definitely not pastel." We quickly realized this stealth gardener was focusing on properties owned by the more vocal critics of Karen's pastel regime. Rumors ablaze. Some guessed it might be a rebellious neighbor who opposed Karen by placing bright flowers everywhere. But that idea lost steam when we recalled Karen's track record of micromanaging. She insisted on pastel exteriors. But what if she had some bizarre notion that hyper-vibrant flowers were acceptable as a complement to the pastel walls? The theory sounded crazy, until we remembered that Karen's entire approach was crazy. Chloe and I decided to set up a motion-activated camera on my front porch, hidden in a decorative lantern. Over the course of a few nights, we captured footage of stray dogs, a roaming raccoon, and multiple neighbors out for late walks. But no flower planters. Then, on the fourth night, I awakened to my phone buzzing, a motion alert. By the time I got outside, whomever it was had vanished. In the morning, I discovered a fresh patch of bright orange marigolds added to the bed next to the geraniums. Heart-pounding, I reviewed the camera footage. Although it was somewhat grainy, the figure on screen looked tall, with a hoodie and gloved hands. There was a brief moment when the person turned toward the light, revealing a hint of pale blonde hair. But the hood obstructed most of the face. I replayed it multiple times, feeling a growing suspicion. The posture, the height, could it really be Karen? It seemed ludicrous, but the idea wouldn't leave me. Karen was known to enforce her vision of aesthetics day and night. Could she be trespassing to plant unauthorized flowers? The plants themselves were eye-catching and definitely not in line with her pastel mania for home exteriors, but perhaps she believed garish blooms were permissible so long as the houses remained pastel. It was the kind of contradictory logic only she could harbor. I kept quiet about my suspicion, unsure how to proceed. Meanwhile, Chloe noticed new purple petunias had popped up along her front curb. The next street over, a young couple named Marcus and April claimed they'd witnessed a nighttime trespasser wearing a pastel windbreaker crouching by their flower bed. That tip clinched it for me. A pastel windbreaker practically screamed Karen, though we still lacked definitive proof of her identity. To gather stronger evidence, I upgraded to a better night vision camera, one with higher resolution and a motion sensor floodlight. If the mysterious gardener returned, they'd be caught in brighter illumination and in color. As I waited, I stewed over Karen's hypocrisy. If it was indeed her, why plant these glaringly bright flowers after demanding uniform pastel walls? Was she trying to undermine our yards so she could fine us for having non-compliant color schemes? Or did she see these flowers as an enhancement, furthering her twisted notion of neighborhood improvement? In a surreal twist, some of the neighbors, especially the older ones who barely used the internet, had no idea about the secret plantings. They only saw bright flowers popping up around the community and assumed there was a new landscaping initiative. If only they'd known the subterfuge behind it all. My camera watched, night after night, for over a week. Then, just when I began to think the trespasser had stopped, it happened. Around 2 a.m. one Saturday, the floodlight snapped on, illuminating a slender figure wearing that same pastel windbreaker, hood partially up. The figure carried a small trowel and a plastic tray of flowers. Heart-pounding, I stayed inside, monitoring the live feed from my phone. The motion-activated camera captured everything in vivid detail. Sure enough, the windbreaker had slipped back at one point, revealing the unmistakable blonde bob of Karen Delacroix. She glanced around furtively, then knelt to plant a cluster of shockingly pink zinnias. My jaw dropped. It was Karen, caught red-handed, violating her own rules about uniform pastel standards by adding an explosion of neon color to my yard. I recorded the entire incident, feeling a strange mix of outrage, triumph, and bewilderment. Now I had proof, and I couldn't wait to see how the rest of the HOA board would react. The following day, I couldn't stop replaying the video on my phone, adrenaline surging each time Karen's face appeared in the floodlight. Part of me wanted to confront her on the spot, march to her front door, show her the footage, and demand an explanation. But I realized a more calculated approach might yield better results, especially if we needed to bring this to the HOA board. Chloe, Marcus, and April gathered at my house to watch the incriminating video. Marcus nearly spit out his coffee, exclaiming, "I knew she was insane, but this is next level." We decided we had enough evidence to call a special meeting of the HOA board, as allowed by the bylaws when a homeowner reported egregious misconduct by a board member. Over the next few days, we circulated the footage privately to other neighbors who'd also experienced mysterious flower plantings. Each reaction was the same: shock, then laughter at the sheer hypocrisy, then anger over her brazen trespassing. Before we officially filed the request for a meeting, I sent an email to all 5 board members, excluding Karen, detailing what I'd observed, attaching video stills, and explaining that this was not an isolated incident. At first, I worried they might dismiss or ignore me, but surprisingly, within 24 hours, 3 of them responded. Eric, the HOA president in name, though Karen seemed to overshadow him, wrote a brief reply. "We'll handle this promptly." Lisa, the treasurer, apologized profusely, saying she had suspected Karen was going off the rails but never imagined she'd go so far. Jacob, a relatively new board member, also expressed disbelief and promised to look into it. They arranged a closed-door meeting for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. The board insisted it would be a confidential session to review the evidence. Karen reportedly tried to cancel it, claiming she had urgent business, but the others overruled her. I sensed that Karen's iron grip on the HOA might finally be slipping. On meeting day, I arrived early with Chloe, each of us holding folders containing printed screenshots. The board members sat behind a long table, their expressions a mix of tension and resolve. A lone empty chair waited for Karen. She swept in 10 minutes late, wearing an impeccably tailored pastel pink suit. Her eyes darted around warily as she took her seat. Eric cleared his throat. "We're here to address serious allegations of trespassing and violation of HOA guidelines by one of our own board members. Let's keep this orderly." Karen's lips thinned. "I can't imagine what you mean. There must be some confusion." That's when Lisa asked me to present my evidence. I set up my laptop, connected it to a small projector, and played the nighttime footage. The room fell silent as Karen's hood slipped back on screen, revealing her distinct bob haircut. She was seen kneeling in my yard, systematically planting bright flowers at 2 a.m. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "Karen, that's obviously you. Why would you be planting such garish flowers at night?" Karen's face went pale, then red. I was merely trying to beautify the neighborhood. There's nothing wrong with adding color, and I had permission to do small enhancements." I couldn't help but chime in. "Permission from whom? And these colors clearly defy your own pastel standard, unless blazing neon pink is considered pastel now." Karen turned her glare on me. "Don't lecture me. I did not break any rules. The guidelines about pastel exteriors don't apply to flowers." Lisa interjected. "The real issue is trespassing. You're on record threatening to fine people for minor infractions, yet you took it upon yourself to plant flowers without homeowners' consent, in the dead of night, no less." Karen fumbled for a retort, insisting she had a right to maintain community aesthetics. But each excuse sounded more desperate than the last. She claimed the footage was inconclusive, but the board members simply shook their heads. The images were clear enough to capture her face, and she was literally wearing the same pastel windbreaker in which she'd been seen patrolling the neighborhood many times before. Eric rubbed his temples. "Karen, we appreciate your volunteer service, but this is beyond the pale. You trespassed on private property, and you've repeatedly used the HOA's authority to push personal agendas. This is a breach of trust." Karen tried one last tactic, blaming the community's poor upkeep for forcing her hand. "Some people let their yards get too plain," she sputtered. "My flowers were an improvement." I stared at her, incredulous. Plain yards? We'd all been forced under threat of fines to adopt a pastel color scheme that arguably was more boring than the original neutral tones. Now, in her bizarre logic, we needed bright neon blooms? The board exchanged pointed looks, clearly fed up. Eventually, Eric announced they would deliberate privately, asking Karen and me to step out of the room. We waited in a dim hallway for nearly 20 minutes. I could hear muffled voices raised in heated discussion. Karen stood rigid, tapping a manicured nail against her phone screen. She shot me occasional dirty looks, as though I were the villain in this scenario. Inside, I felt a swell of relief, certain that once the board conferred, they'd see reason and hold her accountable. Finally, Lisa popped her head out and motioned for us to return. The board had prepared a statement. Karen was to be suspended from any enforcement duties immediately. They would hold a broader membership vote next month to determine if she should be removed from the board entirely. Meanwhile, an official letter of censure would be filed against her for trespassing and violating her own aesthetic guidelines. Furthermore, they clarified that the Pastel mandate would be reviewed, hinting strongly it might be rescinded or at least relaxed. Karen's face burned crimson. She muttered about ungrateful residents and spineless colleagues before storming out, her heels clicking furiously on the tile floor. For those of us who had dealt with her tyranny, it was a sweet victory indeed. Even so, I knew the fight might not be fully over. Karen was nothing if not persistent. But at least, for the moment, the tide had turned. The aftermath of Karen's suspension rippled through Rosemore Crest. Word traveled fast, and soon everyone knew about the incriminating footage of the secret gardener. Reactions ranged from disbelief to delight. Some neighbors, especially those who had already paid a fortune to repaint their homes in pastel, were furious at Karen for her apparent double standard. Others laughed uproariously at the absurdity of her creeping around in the dead of night to plant neon blooms. The HOA board sent out a memo acknowledging recent leadership issues and promising a thorough review of all major rules, including the Pastel Edict. It stated that no fines would be levied for non-compliance until they completed their review. Dozens of homeowners who had yet to repaint heaved a collective sigh of relief. A few even demanded reimbursements for the paint jobs they'd already paid for under duress, though that issue remained unresolved. Meanwhile, Karen slipped into relative obscurity. She no longer roamed the streets with a clipboard, nor did she appear at the mailbox cluster to critique people's lawn ornaments. On the rare occasions I spotted her, usually in her car or hurriedly walking her Pomeranian, she avoided eye contact. She had lost her aura of command, replaced by a sort of seething resentment that emanated from her rigid posture. Inside the neighborhood's chat groups and informal gatherings, folks savored the downfall of the once dominant Pastel Queen. Yet, some cautioned that we shouldn't celebrate too soon. Karen still held an official board seat until the vote to remove her, and she had supporters who believed she'd been unfairly targeted. A handful of residents even marched door to door, collecting signatures to reinstate Karen's authority, arguing that her strict methods had kept the community tidy. Their petition garnered little traction, as most people were too relieved to be free of her constant scrutiny. For me personally, life at Rosemore Crest improved exponentially. The tension that had hovered over my daily routine evaporated. I continued to water the dayglow flowers Karen had planted. Ironically, they had grown on me. Perhaps out of spite, or perhaps out of genuine appreciation for their cheerful brightness, I decided to keep them. My yard was now a playful mix of desert succulents and brilliant geraniums, marigolds, and petunias, a visual testament to Karen's contradictory mania for control. Interestingly, the community seemed to gain a newfound sense of unity in the wake of Karen's misstep. Neighbors who hardly knew each other began exchanging friendly waves or stopping for casual chats. We compared stories of Karen's previous demands, some so ridiculous they sounded made up. One neighbor recounted how Karen tried to measure the distance between stepping stones in her garden. Another swore that Karen threatened a fine for having a mail slot that was not flush with the door. Now that her power was curtailed, these stories surfaced with a blend of exasperation and humor. The big question remained: would the HOA officially overturn the Pastel mandate? The board's memo hinted they would revisit it, but a faction of residents who liked the uniform pastel look argued it should remain. Many houses had already been painted and didn't want to pay for another change. Others, like me, had never painted in the first place and wanted the freedom to choose any color within reason. The board scheduled an open forum to gather input, promising a formal vote within a month. Karen might have lost her enforcement privileges, but she still had a seat on that board until the membership voted otherwise. In the weeks leading to the forum, I occasionally saw her handing out flyers that touted the beauty and harmony of the pastel scheme, claiming that property values had soared thanks to her initiative. Her personal brand of intimidation had softened into persuasive rhetoric, but the tone was still unmistakably arrogant. She was the visionary who had saved Rosemore Crest from blandness, or so she claimed. Perhaps the strangest development was that a few neighbors started praising the random flowers Karen had planted. Some said it added charm or whimsy to the otherwise cautious approach to landscaping. This led to a wave of inside jokes. Karen the covert gardener, Karen's midnight miracle blooms, and so forth. People teased that, in the end, she'd ironically made the neighborhood more colorful than her official pastel policy ever intended. When the much-anticipated open forum arrived, nearly half the neighborhood crowded into the community center. Old controversies resurfaced, as did new proposals for the future of Rosemore Crest. The board, minus Karen for the main discussion, she was asked to recuse herself given the conflict of interest, gathered on stage to hear input. Homeowners stepped up to a microphone one by one, voicing grievances, sharing opinions about color schemes, and questioning how the HOA should move forward. Elaine, the mother of two who'd worried about repainting costs, spoke passionately about the financial burden placed on families. George insisted the HOA's core function should be maintaining roads and organizing events, not policing paint hues. Even a couple of residents who liked the pastel uniformity admitted they felt the process had been too heavy-handed. By the end of the 2-hour session, it was clear that most people wanted a broader, more flexible color palette, allowing each homeowner to choose from a wide range of neutrals or soft tones without mandatory pastel. After a brief break, Karen was allowed back in to present her case. She strode to the microphone, determined to salvage her legacy. She recited a list of bullet points. Market research shows cohesive neighborhoods command higher resale prices. Pastels provide a signature brand that sets Rosemore Crest apart. But her arguments landed weakly, especially after the revelations of her secret flower escapades. Someone in the crowd shouted, "What about the neon flowers, Karen?" And giggles rippled through the room. She stiffened but pressed on, claiming the nighttime planting was a misunderstood act of community service. Finally, the board held a vote among all attending members and counted absentee ballots submitted earlier. The result was decisive. The restrictive pastel mandate would be repealed and replaced by a more moderate guideline reminiscent of the HOA's original policies: ample choices, no single color forced on everyone. A smattering of applause and cheers broke out, a tangible sense of relief filling the air. The board then moved on to address Karen's position. A formal recall vote was held. Though a small contingent still supported her, the overwhelming majority favored her removal. She listened in stony silence as Eric announced the final count. By the end of that evening, Karen Delacroix was no longer a board member. She stood, glaring at the audience, her cheeks flushed. Without a word, she gathered her documents and strode out the side door. I never saw her look back. A few days later, a new volunteer stepped up to fill the vacant board seat. Marilyn Johnson, the same neighbor who had once brought me cookies and quietly warned me about Karen. Marilyn promised an HO rooted in fairness, transparency, and genuine service to the community. She proposed that any large-scale changes, like forcing a universal color scheme, be approved by a significant majority of homeowners, not just a small board vote. The applause at the next HOA meeting signaled strong approval for this new era. As for Karen's personal fate, rumors swirled. Some said she put her house on the market, furious that her grand vision had collapsed. Others claimed she might stay, but keep a low profile, perhaps hoping to outlast the memory of her scandal. Occasionally, I glimpsed her in her driveway, loading boxes into her trunk, or scowling as she walked her dog. The pastel windbreaker was nowhere to be seen, replaced by more neutral attire. In time, Rosemore Crest settled into a genuinely peaceful routine. Many houses remained pastel. Those owners had grown accustomed to the shades or couldn't afford another repaint, but now they coexisted with dwellings in sandy browns, soft grays, or gentle taupes. Gardens sprouted with all sorts of blossoms, from subdued desert plants to flamboyant annuals. My own front yard continued to flaunt Karen's neon geraniums, petunias, and zinnias. Far from mocking me, they became a private source of amusement and even joy. The nightly stealth planting had turned into an unexpected gift. I ended up with a more colorful, lively space than I'd ever envisioned. Neighbors learned to talk openly about community decisions rather than cowering under the specter of arbitrary fines. The new board spent time updating outdated rules, emphasizing collaboration over punishment. We enjoyed community barbecues, holiday lights that stayed up as long as people wanted, and a revived spirit of genuine neighborliness. Occasionally, at these gatherings, someone would bring up the pastel fiasco or the story of Karen sneaking around at midnight with a trowel. We'd share a collective laugh, marveling at how bizarrely controlling one person could be and how her downfall ultimately united us. In the end, Karen's ironically colorful sabotage had hastened her own undoing and set the stage for a more balanced, harmonious Rosemore crest. I sometimes muse over that final image caught on my camera, Karen in her pastel windbreaker, illuminated by my motion floodlight, planting neon flowers in a yard she had just criticized for being too dull. It symbolizes everything about her twisted reign, contradiction, hypocrisy, and an obsessive need for control. Yet those same flowers now bloom proudly, a testament to resilience and the indomitable spirit of a community that refused to bow to tyranny.